Joining me right now is Tom Gross, Middle East analyst and human rights activist specializing in the region. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. It seems that the Arab world, the Muslim world, is not finding the solution to actually find a stability. How can we even expect a stability when they cannot find peace among themselves?
Well, yes, I think that's an understatement that we can't find a peaceful resolution. I fear that we're actually at the beginning of a much longer and bloodier period of conflict, a little bit akin to some of the wars in Europe in the Middle Ages. We have the 30 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, and so on. So I fear that we're still at the beginning of the beginning. We're not even at the end of the beginning. I do think this is a clarifying moment, though, because we know that since 1979 there's been rivalry between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Sunni Wahhabi-led Saudi Arabia, I think this is coming to fruition in a much more open way for the world to see. Yemen seems to be the battlefield on which it's playing out at present, but as we know, virtually every country in the Arab world is now at some level of conflict or other. War is nothing new, but we're living in a much more interconnected, globalized world. The level of the populations are bigger, the level of weaponry is more deadly. Everything is televised. If it's not televised by television stations, then ordinary people are posting to YouTube, as we see Syria is the first war that's essentially a YouTubed war. ISIS are not the worst terrorist group ever, but they're the most shocking in a sense because they very skillfully make quite professionally done videos designed to shock and terrorize, and it works. Certainly in human history, we may have lived in worse times, but there's something particularly upsetting in 2015 where we would hope that the world would progress somehow, that we seem to be moving backwards, particularly in the Middle East. And it's particularly horrific because we all know what's happening in Syria, and yet psychologically we just turn a blind eye to it.
Yeah. Of course, the interests of the United States were much more important than actually maintaining the order in the Middle East.
Iraq is the perfect example. Between Shia and Sunni, Saddam Hussein, and the war, destroying the army, restructuring the army. Egypt, for instance, this is the second. So I see here inconsistent foreign policy of the Americans in the Middle East.
I want to take this word, inconsistent.
I'd just like to add, I agree with what you said, and I'd like to add one extra thing. The State Department and up to a point the White House have been extremely focused on the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, which is obviously an important dispute. But it means that when other conflagrations have occurred, like in Syria, a great proportion of the experts in Washington and indeed in academia in America or the New York Times are obsessed with the question of Palestine and the Palestinian-Israeli question to such an extent that when the Arab Spring broke out, they didn't have enough experts. They don't know what to do. I mean, just today, there was a big bombing of a refugee camp in Yemen, 45 dead, supposedly by the Saudi Air Force. And the BBC reported it about an hour ago as their main news headline. And the main news anchor asked the guest from Yemen, why has there been a refugee camp created in the last few days? The war only started 4 days ago. And the studio guest said, no, Yemen's been at war since 2004. So this is the lead BBC world anchor is not even aware there was a war going on.
It's not.
Also in the United States, there's sharp divisions, as we know, between Republicans and Democrats. So if a Republican-led presidency intervened in Iraq, the incoming Democratic-led presidency of Barack Obama wanted to do the opposite. So one could argue that the intervention in Iraq was a mistake and created more unrest, but I would say the lack of intervention in Syria at the beginning may have also caused that country to destabilize more than it might have done. I mean, the Americans are in a very difficult position because, for better or worse, they're still the world leader leader, the global power, and they have a large part of America doesn't want to play this role. It wants to sort of pass it on to the United Nations or the so-called international community.
Yeah, but Tom,
the reality is there is no other power that can play such a role.
But Tom, I'm trying to understand, is it only the policy of Barack Obama? Is it the policy of the Democrats? Is it going to be the policy of the next Democratic president? Is it going to be the policy of the Republicans that are going to understand that maybe the domestic problems are more important than ruling the world? Is it beginning to be the policy of the United States to stay out of things and say, let them handle their problems alone, and we will just send
I think they'd like
some coalition forces?
I think they'd like to, but I think it will prove impossible. I mean, the world's interconnected, even though oil is going to play a less important role, Middle Eastern oil, in future. As we see, since you mentioned Charlie Hebdo, there is a spillover, there's a spillover of political Islamism at its most extreme in terroristic and attacks in New York and Washington and London and Paris and Madrid and so on. And for that reason, there is a difference between now and the 1960s in that it affects people, different for the Westerners, than it affects Westerners more closely or directly. They die in Western capitals. So I don't think the West has any choice but to play a role. The question is, it's very muddled. Let's give the example of Libya. Britain and France, aided by the United States, helped to overthrow the government of Libya. Now, that may have been a good thing or a bad thing, but what wasn't a good thing is the moment Gaddafi was gone, they just left, and now it's in total chaos. If you're going to overthrow, then you've got to stay on and help build a better state than under Gaddafi. If you're now living in Syria and you're being bombed on the one side by Assad and the other side ISIS encroaching on you, you want the United States to intervene. You want them to bomb Assad's air force so he can't bomb you anymore. I mean, it's a case-by-case example.
So
even if the Middle East is not ready for democracy European style or Canadian style, that doesn't mean we should turn a blind eye to the most incredible abuse of human rights. It is not okay that people are beheaded or chemical weapons are used. I think as the world need to try to stop it however we can.
Yeah, definitely. Gentlemen, thank you very, very much.